Hi, this is Jonathan Manoa and I will be presenting on UML Communication Diagrams. Unfortunately, Keith was not able to make it tonight. So what is a communication diagram? A communication diagram utilizes UML. So it looks similar to other UML diagrams that you may have seen, such as a class diagram. However, instead of showing the functions and the variables that are to be used, it represents and shows us the flow of messages, or how objects communicate with each other. It shows similar information to a sequence diagram. However, a communication diagram primarily focuses on the relationships between the objects rather than the sequence of messages that are sent between the objects. It is also formally called a collaboration diagram. On the next slide, we'll be able to see the different symbols or notation that are used in order to understand a communication diagram. Next, we'll discuss the symbols and notation that are needed for us to understand in order to be able to understand the UML communication diagram. The first symbol is a rectangle. Rectangles represent objects or classes that are needed to make up the application. These rectangles are then connected with lines. The lines represent the different relationships between each of the classes or objects that are within our application. Next, we have arrows. Arrows represent messages sent between the objects, or in other words, it shows us the flow of communication that is between the objects or classes that we have. Next, we will have numbers. Numbers let us understand the order in which messages are being sent and how many messages are needed to finish the process. Or in other words, it tells us what is being communicated between the different objects or classes. On the next slide, we will discuss about messages so we can understand what exactly is being communicated between the different objects or classes. Messages is how objects communicate with each other. They are equivalent to a message that is found in a sequence diagram, and implies that an object uses the services of another object or sends a message to that object. Or in other words, messages can be sent from one object to another, or they can be sent from the second object back to the first, or both. Messages are ordered to reflect the sequence of the diagram, or in other words, they're ordered so that we understand how information is being passed and in what order. At the bottom of this slide, we can see an example of how objects or how messages are ordered. We will now take a look at an example of a UML communication diagram. On this slide, we can see two examples of different ways of diagramming very similar information. The first example is of a sequence diagram. In this example, we can see the sequence in which messages are sent and when messages are received. From the example, we can see that the customer will send 2 messages to the card reader, and then a third message, when that is sent, then gets passed on to another class before a 4th message is sent to the card reader class. This is how generally the sequence diagram works. Next, we have the communication diagram. The communication diagram is giving us the same information as the sequence diagram, but instead of the sequence of the messages that are sent, it is only showing us interaction between the various classes. So in this one, we still can see that the customer is interacting with the card reader and is sending 3 messages, as well as a 4th that is being returned back to the customer. However, we don't know the exact order in which all these different messages are being sent or looped around between the various classes or objects. It is also important to note that with a communication diagram, there's less emphasis on the layout as the classes in relation to each other, but rather the arrows or the lines show the relationship between the classes. We will now move on to the next slide, the pros and cons to using a communication diagram. First, for the pros. One, we can visualize the flow of communication between entities. Or in other words, we can clearly see how information is being passed between the various objects or classes, or how they're communicating between each other. Second, it focuses on what is communicated rather than the sequence of communication. So before we understand the sequence of operations or messages that need to be sent to each other, a UML communication diagram shows us what is being passed. This will give us a nice overview as how a program will work. And lastly, UML communication diagrams are very flexible. If you need to remove something, you don't have to rearrange the entire diagram in order to either add a class or an object or to remove one. For the cons, the first one that we have is that it's more difficult to see the sequences of messages. This is because the UML communication diagram doesn't necessarily care as far as the sequence of messages, but what messages are being sent. And then the second con is there are other tools such as sequence diagrams that can be more useful for different situations. On the next slide, which will be our last slide, we will talk about a recommendation for using the UML communication diagram. So would we recommend the UML communication diagram? We absolutely would for its benefits, specifically of that being able to have a visual representation of how classes and objects are communicating with each other. It gives us a good view of that because instead of having to see every individual sequence or step of the communication or messages that are being sent, we can get a nice overview of how and what is being communicated between them. The other benefit, which was talked about on the last slide, is how flexible it is. It's very easy to manipulate it, to add, to remove, without having to redraw the entire diagram. So for these reasons, we would definitely recommend it, especially if you use it along with other UML diagrams that will be presented throughout this class. On our last slide, we have our references. So while this is our last content slide, we do have one more that has references used in order to create this presentation. Thank you for watching, and if you need to look at other slides, feel free to pause at any time to learn and study more. Thank you.